You can name every part of your burnout in your experience and still be burning out. You can sit in your office between sessions and you can even identify countertransference with supervision or consultation. You can look at your schedule and identify the cumulative load. I even have a spreadsheet created. It's like a caseload ecology spreadsheet where I can, once a month, I put in, of course, like non-identifying client markers, like a number, and where they're at in their therapy, how much energy it takes for me, and whether or not they're in crisis, etc. And at the end of that, it's like such a cool little spreadsheet. It calculates whether or not I can see more people and take on new clients. I use that regularly, like every month. You can still identify that. You can still notice any boundary patterns that you might have. You can teach all of that stuff. And at the same time, you can still be falling apart. So, today I want to talk about something that research keeps pointing at, specifically in our work, that we don't talk enough about in clinical training. And it moves beyond self awareness, it moves beyond spreadsheets, and it moves toward the idea that we can have the self awareness, but awareness without action really doesn't do much for us. Today's episode is a topic that I'll be returning back to over the next little while. And the topic is about our use of self in session and how that can actually protect us from burnout. Even though it does require maintenance, it's like an instrument that needs to be tuned, but that we can bring our whole self into the therapy room and still be ethical, still prevent burnout, and still be clinically effective without losing who we are. So let's get into it. And if you're a previous listener, welcome back, friends. My name is Stacey Steele, and this is the Relit Practice Podcast. If we have not met yet, I work with clinicians like therapists, psychologists, social workers, nurses, and other helping professionals who are tired sometimes in a way that doesn't get better on the weekends. And most of us are really good at what we do, and that might be part of the reason why we're tired. Today's episode is for the helper who has done the inner work, who knows the language of attachment and trauma, who can name countertransference in their sleep, and who is still somehow exhausted at the end of the day, and that insight is not fixing it. Today's episode is going to touch on research that explains why. And this research, honestly, for me, has been very eye-opening than a lot of wellness content that I'm seeing on social media. So let's start with what we mean by the therapeutic self. So the literature on this uses a few different terms: use of self, therapeutic presence, the therapist instrument, but all of it's pointing to the same thing: purposeful use of our personality, our emotions, and even our vulnerabilities in service of the work that we do. And across different theoretical orientations, the use of self, like being ourselves in therapy, is constant. But the pieces of it, depending on what you might read, include therapeutic self-disclosure, how we purposely share something in service of the client, authenticity or congruence, the alignment between who we are and how we show up in the room, and then the inner dialogue that is going on concurrently which is really our ongoing conversation between our experiencing selves, our authentic self, and our professional self. So the last one is maybe what we are trained in the most: the ongoing inner monitoring. Like, what's coming up for me right now? What does this remind me of? Is this mine or is this theirs? So that is so important and it matters. I'm not here to tell you that it doesn't matter. We need that. And sometimes it overshadows the actions that we can take on that. Really early in my career, I had two different kind of mentors. One, like blank slate for the client in front of them. The client knew nothing about any of their personal preferences beyond what they could see in the room. Any questions that the client asked about the therapist were met with, like, what makes that important for you to know, and those kind of things. Somebody else who was so personal with their clients that the clients would know about their dog's name. They really brought themselves into the session. Now, those are two opposites of the same coin. But what if we integrate both of those approaches, meaning that we have this professional self, and DBT, we might even call it like the logic mind, and then this personal self, maybe like our emotional self. But what about wisdom? not to bring DBT too much into this, but really think of it that way. If we're always like this blank slate and purely logical, that can be so growth enhancing for the client. And I mean, psychoanalysis is built on that. And yet, our authentic self is an important factor in the room as well, too. And on the other hand, we don't want to cross boundaries and make a session about ourselves. How many times has the client come in and say they left their last counselor because that session was all about them and they knew about their counselor's divorce and their therapist's medical issues? And really, I hear it all the time. Well, they were nice enough, but I really wasn't getting what I needed. So we have this dichotomy. So we don't want to go so far that somebody doesn't get what they need. But at the same time, we don't want to like abstain and refrain so much that the most important part of ourselves isn't there to be in service of the client either. So what the research actually shows when you look at burnout outcomes specifically, when we talk about the therapeutic use of self, there's a 2015 study with other psychotherapists that found that self-awareness was related to burnout, but only indirectly through wellness behaviors. So self-awareness on its own did not buffer the impact of burnout or cumulative stress, but the awareness of what somebody needs and then they acted on it did. So essentially, insight without action really doesn't do much to protect us. In 2020, there was another study done that found something even a little bit more uncomfortable, and this one was a little tender for me to read. They found that certainty about mental states. So feeling like, oh, I know what's going on for me. I don't need anyone to tell me. I don't need to inquire anymore. Predicted more burnout later on, not less. So I'm talking about perceived certainty. The clinician or therapist who didn't have an openness to other reasons or other explanations of what they were experiencing actually crashed even harder later on. In 2022, there was a study done on psychologist engagement in reflective practice and found that there's only limited and actually domain specific correlations with burnout. So reflection can be helpful, and certainly please don't not reflect, but it wasn't the protective factor that we treat it as. And then finally, there's a 2020 qualitative study, the work on the use of self named what was happening directly, that wellness, so they define wellness as attention to one's own health, was the consistently underemphasized dimension, the underemphasized factor that mitigated burnout. So what does that tell us? And if you want, there'll be links in the show notes to all these studies, is that when we put all of this together, we see a pattern that we can be trained to monitor our inner experience, to observe our outer experience, and to track clients and track ourselves. But we haven't been trained to recover it. What do we do with that information about ourselves that we find out? So the distinction would be awareness on its own is like the noticing part of it. So please keep noticing, keep reflecting. But it tells us what might be happening, but it doesn't change what's happening. If you've been carrying a really high caseload, you haven't been able to get supervision, or there's like total chaos in your organization, and you've been maybe witnessing that for years, more awareness of that isn't going to help you. More awareness of that is not going to change anything meaningful for you. You can know why you're exhausted and still be exhausted. So if awareness is not protection for us, then what? So one way of looking at it, I'm going to go back to that wise mind analogy, is that we have our professional self on one hand. And that professional self in some ways is observing our personal, our authentic self. And they're noticing what that personal self is feeling, the body sensations, the thoughts, the bias, all of that kind of thing. And yet we're still experiencing the exhaustion. And at times, maybe even our professional self could be judgmental of our personal self. Like, I shouldn't have said that reflection back. I laughed too hard at that joke the client made, or maybe I even became a little teary-eyed when they were describing something. And then we can really beat ourselves up for that. So one of the mitigating factors across the literature and even in practice is self-compassion. Kristen Neff has done so much work on this, so please check her out if you already aren't aware. But it's not necessarily a mindset. It's not like a vibe. It is a measurable variable that shows up over and over again that's actually protective for us in this work. So that burnout, especially emotional exhaustion and depersonalization, is actually negatively related to self-compassion. It essentially means that having good work-life balance protects us, but how it protects us was allowing self-compassion to function. And so if our professional self is critical of our personal self, how can a professional self provide more self-compassion to the personal self while still maintaining boundaries and promoting good therapeutic outcomes? Even when it comes to mindfulness, the mindfulness part of self-compassion is something that can be related to less burnout. It's kind of like an inverse. Like the higher your self-compassion is, the lower compassion fatigue might be. And so if our professional self is being more compassionate to our personal self, what does our professional self need to do? I'm going to go back to certainty. The idea that we're certain, like this is the right way, or I know exactly what's happening here. It actually can be, as I said before, it can be detrimental. And there is a finding that I kept going back to. It's actually from 2015, and there'll be a link to it. The title is actually kind of took me off guard, but it's Love Yourself as a Person, Doubt Yourself as a Therapist. So that hit me because I'm like, what do you mean doubt yourself? All this talk about imposter syndrome. I mean, so much of my work has been on combating the inner critic. What that author meant was that love yourself as a person, so self-compassion. Doubting yourself as a therapist meant to approach the therapeutic container with curiosity and genuine humility. So they use the word doubt in kind of a looser way here, but it was really about if I could show my personal self compassion and professionally, I can demonstrate humility and even professional curiosity. That combination, so this is not self criticism plus confidence or self compassion plus certainty. The combination of compassion and humility showed up the most in clinicians who had more sustainability in their practice. So, literally, the way we treat ourselves and the way we treat the work can be a clinical variable for our clients and for ourselves. So, just sit with that for a moment, that how we treat ourselves is not separate from our clinical work. It actually can shape outcomes, it shapes our longevity in this work, and it can maybe even be a helpful predictor of who's still doing this work and feeling energized by it 15 years into it. The research is clear that self-compassion can buffer burnout. And it's also very clear that self-compassion does not and absolutely cannot replace the structural conditions that somebody's working in. So central themes with compassion fatigue and burnout include, yes, internal awareness. So we got that. Also the boundaries that we hold within our workplace and with our clients, the support we have socially, what we do for leisure time after hours, how we process with our peers, and even like time with family and friends, physical exercise, checkups, that kind of thing. So those are really concrete behaviors. It's not just a mindset. Yeah, it's concrete behaviors, concrete relationships, and actual physical time in a schedule that is set aside for taking care of ourselves, the feeding and watering of ourselves, essentially. I like to think of it that self-compassion, professional humility is almost like a little gas on the fire for work-life balance, so to speak, or work-life harmony. It makes that our efforts go even further. So when I say self-compassion is the strongest individual level buffer, no individual level buffer compensates for like structural chaos and instability, including workloads that are way too high and client or caseload acuity that is imbalanced. Because you really can't self-compassion your way out of like a 70 client caseload, and you can't mindfulness your way out of inadequate supervision, and you can't reflective practice your way out of an organization that punishes you for trying to slow down. So please keep doing like the individual factors. And why I'm sharing that piece is actually as a part of promoting self-compassion, is that operating within some of these systems can be quite demoralizing and demotivating and can almost feel like a sense of powerlessness. Applying self-compassion when you're experiencing that, it's really a necessity. It's not a way, it's not like the Care Bear stare that's going to ward off any negative effects of working in those systems, but it can maybe be a soft place to land. When we go back to the therapeutic self, whether you're in a chaotic system or one that actually flows pretty smoothly, if you think about the therapeutic use of self happens in three layers. So the first one is awareness. And yes, awareness alone is not protection, but still need it. And the second is compassion. So how you treat what the awareness shows you. So that professional self, what it's learning about the personal self, and how you treat it. So this is the aspect that the research points to as like a consistent buffer. It's a difference of noticing when you're exhausted to meeting that exhaustion with hostility versus meeting it with like care and compassion. And then that third layer, that third aspect is the conditions, the structure in which you work in, like caseload composition, the hours of work, having a good relationship with a supervisor, peer processing, peer consultation, recovery time in between sessions and at the end of the day. So the first two aspects of awareness and compassion, those are inside jobs. It's you. And the third one is around. So all three make up your own personal clinical infrastructure. They're not nice to haves, they're not personal preferences. It's like your infrastructure in which you're working in. And burnout most often happens when those first two layers are overcompensating for the absence of appropriate structural conditions. So this is a lot of what the relit practice is based on. It's based on, first of all, awareness, absolutely awareness and recognition that awareness without and then action most often includes self-compassion really doesn't get you far. And it's also based on how to navigate some of these structural conditions when you can't outright change them, but how can you survive in them and maybe even thrive in them? And really, like how I relate to this is somebody and how I relate to this is think of somebody in this work who can articulate every dimension of what they're going through in clinical language. They might even do their own outcome measures. They might have like this nice spreadsheet, like what I mentioned I have before, in a really tidy package. And they can say, this is why I'm feeling that way. This could be the clinician who can identify the countertransference like that. They can look at the caseload and know that it's too much. They maybe have even read all of the books. They've done their own therapy. Maybe they still go. And they're by any meaningful direction, not lacking in self awareness. So if you know of such a person, maybe bring them up. Maybe that person is you, and maybe that person is clearly falling apart, and that person doesn't need more insight. They've already hit almost like I like to call insight saturation. It's where all the self help books and starts to sound the same, and they don't need more self care advice. They know. And I tell my clients this all the time, it's not a knowing problem. It's what they need. And maybe what you need is a structured way to recover, a way to relate your own exhaustion with the same steadiness that you're able to offer your clients, and maybe a clear-eyed look at the structures around you that no longer work for you or maybe never did. If you're listening to this and this episode is landing, I built a free resource called the Reset Checklist that is exactly for this. It's a 10-minute exercise of 5 different domains that you can just check in on yourself. It's centered on 5 different domains based on the Relit practice framework that is more than an inventory about what's wrong with you and more of a framework that's built around what is possible for me. It's free. The link is in the show notes. Another way of doing that is joining the Reset Circle, which is a no-cost monthly gathering for therapists and other helping professionals who want to stay in this work without losing themselves. While we navigate burnout, maybe moral strain, and even the emotional and physical weight of practicing inside demanding systems, including public health, nonprofit, and private practice. Our next circle is May 12th at 7 p.m. Eastern, and the topic is bringing your whole self into the therapy room, much like what we've been talking about today. And we'll be looking at the cost of separating our human self and our professional self, maybe the signals that the two selves have drifted too far apart, and what it might look like to bring both selves back into the same room. Registration is in the show notes, and it gives you access to the replay, subscription to the Relit Practice newsletter, and the Reset Checklist. Each free 1-hour gathering includes a guided grounding practice, a brief masterclass tied to a Relit practice pillar. Topics might include naming your experience, patterns that keep us stuck, wellness, building sustainable practice, and clinical excellence, just to name a few. Opportunity for self-reflection, and an optional share with peers who understand. And this is for psychologists, counselors, social workers, and therapists across public systems, agencies, and private practice. And thank you, friend, for being here. And I will see you in the next episode.